the Laughing Cavalier here, presenting to you another tale of these troubled times. Today, I shall be looking at a small yet rather interesting battle that occurred during the American War of Independence, the Battle of Camden. Firstly, a bit of backstory. By 1780, the war between the American colonies and the British Crown was at a stalemate. New York had fallen to the British in 1776, but by the following year the Americans had won a decisive victory at Saratoga, and, coupled with the entry of France into the war on the side of the Americans, along with Spain and the Netherlands also declaring separate wars, the British could no longer concentrate their forces to win an outright victory. But neither could the Americans completely dislodge the British on their own. In 1780, General Sir Henry Clinton, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in North America, had devised a strategy with which he had hoped to win the war. It was clear that the North, where the bulk of the fighting had taken place up to this point, would no longer yield any great victories, and so he decided to mass an army of 14,000 men and sail it south, taking the war to the Carolinas. The southern colonies, it was hoped, would yield more forces loyal to the Crown, and perhaps sway the balance in the favour of the British. In May, Charleston, the capital of South Carolina, surrendered with over 5,000 men being taken prisoner. Despite this victory, though, all was not well within the British camp. Clinton did not have a very good relationship with some of his subordinates, who had been loyal to his predecessor General Howe. Most notable amongst these was his second-in-command, Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis, arguably the most capable British commander of the war. In June, Clinton returned to New York, leaving Cornwallis in command in the south. Soon enough, British forces were on the move. The commander of his cavalry, Lieutenant Colonel Banastre at Tarleton, won a victory at the Waxhaws, although it was soon betrayed by the Americans as a massacre, which has lasted to this very day. After these setbacks, the Americans decided to send reinforcements to the south. Major General Baron de Kalb, a German officer who had served in the French army and was now in American service, was given command of 8 regiments of foot and marched south. The infantry were of the Continental Line, the professional troops of the American army. 7 regiments were from Maryland, and had proven themselves numerous times. The other regiment was from Delaware, the only Continental Line regiment from that state. Nicknamed the Delaware Blues due to their smart appearance, they were probably one of the best the Americans had to offer, famously holding up the British army at Long Island, giving time for Washington's army to escape and preventing the capture of the entire Continental Army in that battle. At the end of July, it was decided to give overall command to Major General Horatio Gates, the victor of Saratoga, and this decision would prove fatal. The American forces continued their push into South Carolina, despite the protests of some officers, who described the area as being sparsely populated and more loyal to the British, which would soon hamper supplies for the army. They were soon reinforced though by a large force of militia, the bulk being from North Carolina, with a sizable detachment from Virginia. They also received a force of cavalry led by Armand, a French officer also in American service. By August, the American army was advancing on the town of Camden, which was garrisoned by about 1,000 men under the command of Lord Rawdon. He sent word to Cornwallis, who arrived with reinforcements. At the exact moment Cornwallis arrived, Gates had decided on a forced night march, and Armand's cavalry collided with Tarleton's cavalry at around 2 in the morning. But, not wanting a night battle, both armies withdrew and prepared to fight in the morning. Gates knew full well that many of his troops were inferior, but Brigadier General Edward Stevens told him that it is too late to retreat now, we must fight. The morning of the 16th of August 1780. Gates, having served as an officer in the British Army before the war, deployed his army rather traditionally, with his best troops on the right flank and his worst on the left. He had 2 brigades of regulars, the 2nd Maryland Brigade, being made of the Delaware Regiment, the 2nd, 4th and 6th Maryland Regiments, numbering barely 550 men under the command of Brigadier General Mordecai Gist. Behind them in reserve was the 1st Maryland Brigade, made up of the 1st, 3rd, 5th and 7th Maryland Regiments, only 400 strong, led by Brigadier General William Smallwood. The centre was held by Major General Richard Caswell and 3 brigades of North Carolina militia, numbering about 1,800 or so men. The left flank was commanded by Brigadier General Edward Stevens, being made up of about 700 or so Virginian militiamen, a troop of 70 South Carolina militia cavalry, Armand's Legion being made up of about 60 cavalry and 60 infantry, and some Virginia state troopers acting as light infantry, numbering no more than 100 men. Support was provided by the 1st Continental Artillery from Virginia, which had 7 6-pounder guns. 2 were supporting the 1st Maryland Brigade, 3 the 2nd, and 2 were attached to the North Carolina militia. In total, Gates had about 3,700 men, although barely a third were regular infantry. The British forces, on the other hand, were outnumbered. The right flank was made up of professional British infantry, the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers, numbering 291 men, the 33rd Regiment of Foot, numbering 233, and 3 light infantry companies detached from the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 71st and the 1st Battalion of the 16th, respectively, numbering 147 men. The brigade in total had 671 men and was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Webster of the 33rd Regiment. Cornwallis had also deployed his worst troops on the left, but, unlike Gates, the men he had on the left were still regulars and were very capable. This brigade was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Lord Rawdon. Under his command he had the 2nd American Regiment, known as the Volunteers of Ireland, the men being drawn from Irish immigrants to the colonies, numbering 301 men. Next to them was the infantry contingent of the British Legion, actually a loyalist unit, 126 men strong. Next to them was the loyal North Carolina Regiment, a unit made up of Americans loyal to the Crown, numbering 274 men. Finally, on their left, was a detachment of South Carolina militia that was also loyal to the Crown, numbering about 300 men. In total, the left flank had nearly 1,000 men. In reserve was the cavalry of the British Legion, 180 strong. Also in reserve were the 2 battalions of the 71st Highlanders. This regiment had been raised back in 1775 at the start of the war, and had 1,600 men. By this stage of the war, though, the regiment was pitifully low on men. The 1st Battalion had 151 men, the 2nd 110. Also present was a detachment of the Royal Artillery, consisting of 4 6-pounder guns, which were placed in the centre of the line. Including additional support and engineer troops, Cornwallis had about 2,300 men. Despite Gates having nearly 1,400 more men than Cornwallis, the British had more regular troops in their army. The battle started when Gates ordered Stevens and de Kalb, commanded the right flank, to attack. At the same time, Cornwallis, despite being outnumbered, ordered Webster and Rawdon to advance with their brigades. The American artillery, using canister shot, cut down a member of the 33rd, but despite this the regiment, supported by the Fusiliers and light infantry, kept advancing. Meanwhile on the left, Rawdon's attacks were driven back, and soon he was struggling to hold back the Marylanders and the Delaware regiments' counterattack. The line was soon steady though when Cornwallis himself rode amongst the Volunteers of Ireland, shouting for them to keep steady, checking the advance of the Continentals. On the right flank meanwhile, Webster's men were now in range and fired a volley at Stevens' militia. After this one volley, the entire American left flank broke and fled. As one eyewitness put it, the impetuosity with which they advanced, firing and huzzaing, threw the whole body of militia into such a panic that they generally threw down their loaded arms and fled in the utmost consternation. The unworthy example of the Virginians was almost instantly followed by the North Carolinians. It was reported that the Virginia militia fled so quickly that they only suffered 3 wounded. Armand and his cavalry fled as well, leaving the American right completely exposed. At this crucial moment of the battle, Gates turned his horse about and fled with his militia, not stopping till he reached the town of Charlotte in North Carolina, 60 miles away. This disaster now left the Americans outnumbered, with only the 2 Maryland brigades and 1 North Carolina militia brigade that hadn't broken, the only one to do so. Webster, instead of pursuing the fleeing militia, wheeled his brigade about and fired volleys into the militia and the 1st Maryland brigade. De Kalb, now the effective commander of the army, ordered up the reserves, but it was too late. Webster charged with his men. Cornwallis ordered forward Tarleton and his cavalry, who outflanked and then charged the Continentals, finally breaking them. The Continental troops fought bravely, but it was futile. Gist managed to get 100 of his men out successfully in good order by going through a swamp. Another 50 to 60 Marylanders also managed to escape in good order, but most of the men left behind were either killed, wounded or captured. De Kalb was shot 3 times and stabbed 8 times with bayonets before he finally surrendered, dying of his wounds 2 days later. It is reported that Cornwallis, upon seeing the wounds of De Kalb, said, "I am sorry, sir, to see you. Not sorry that you are vanquished, but sorry to see you so badly wounded." He was attended to by Cornwallis's own surgeons. It is claimed that, as he lay dying, he said to a British officer that, "I thank you, sir, for your generous sympathy, but I died the death I always prayed for, the death of a soldier fighting for the rights of man." In a little over an hour, Gates' army had been virtually destroyed. It is estimated the Americans suffered 2,000 casualties compared to the 68 dead, 245 wounded and 11 missing of the British. Gates never commanded a field army again, although, thanks to his previous victory at Saratoga and personal contacts within Congress, he escaped punishment for the debacle. The battle would give the British the initiative in the south for the next year, until setbacks at places like Kings Mountain, Cowpens, etc. began to swing the war back in the favour of the Americans. Nevertheless, for quite a small battle, it was a decisive one, and despite the American losses, it showed just how determined and disciplined their regular infantry were in comparison to their militia. Unlike a certain film that has this battle in it, with a certain gentleman who completely butchers history with a... Okay, sod it, I'm going to review the scene for the Patriot. Now, I know this is something more that people like Brandon F. would normally do. By the way, seriously, go subscribe to his channel. He does a lot of good videos on the American War of Independence and other things. But since my Tudor Rant video is doing pretty well, I thought I'd follow up this history video with a quick rant about the Battle of Camden scene from the Patriot. I won't be reviewing the whole film since, firstly, I don't think I could stand 2 hours of British soldiers being portrayed like literal Nazis, and secondly, History Buffs did a decent review of the film a few years ago, which I think adequately covers my feelings on it. I've never really liked this film. When I was 15, I really got interested in this particular battle, and when the film was shown on Channel 5 one time, I watched this particular scene. I had to turn it off in the end because it was just so terrible. Some YouTubers have uploaded the battle scene to YouTube, so I will link the whole scene below. Most of the rest of this video though will be me reacting to just about everything wrong with this scene, which is only 3 minutes long, so I'll try not to rant too much. The scene starts off with Heath Ledger's character, the son of Mel Gibson's character, watching the battle from some sort of manor house overlooking the battlefield, which is entirely green with well-kept grass. There was no such house in this part of the battlefield. There was a swamp off to the west of the battlefield with a lot of trees here and there, and not a wide open plain like this, not to mention the various creeks and small rivers around the area. We now see the British troops marching into battle. Now, there are three main problems here. Firstly, uniforms. All the British troops in the scene, and pretty much in the entire film, wear red coats with blue facings. Facings referring to the cuffs, collars and lapels of the uniforms. In the British Army, however, the regiments wore different colours. Some had yellow facings, some green, some white, etc. Blue was reserved for royal regiments, units that had distinguished themselves and had a royal title before their name. At Camden, the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers had blue facings, as did the Loyal North Carolina Regiment, but the 33rd had red. The Volunteers of Ireland had green, and the 71st had white. In fact, there are no Highland or Loyalist troops present at all in the Patriot. This presents a problem, since we see that all British troops have bicorns. However, in real life, the Highlanders wore bonnets, while it is believed that the line infantry modified their bicorns and made them into round hats in order to protect themselves from the heat, although this probably varied from regiment to regiment, and in some recreations, some regiments still seem to have bicorns. Following on from that, the second main problem are the regimental standards that are being carried, known as colours. British battalions carried two colours, the King's colour, which was a Union flag with the regimental crest in the middle, and the regimental colour, with the Union flag in the canton, or corner of the flag, with the field or general colour matching the facings of the regiment. So the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, for example, would be blue, the 71st white, and so on. The only exceptions were the 33rd, who had a white regimental colour. Also, the King's colour should be to the right here, since it is the King's colour, and, as far as I'm aware, was usually deployed to the right of the regimental colour. In the film, though, despite having blue facings, the colours are green and white regardless of the facings. The third major problem is the presence of the fifers. Now, whilst they are playing a rather nice rendition of the British Grenadiers, these fifers should not be here. A British infantry battalion was made up of 10 companies. 8 centre companies, who were meant to wear bicorns, a light infantry company, who would be on the left or skirmishing out front, and a grenadier company on the right flank who wore bearskins. Only the grenadier company had fifers. However, for most of the war, the light infantry and grenadier companies were detached from their parent regiments to form grenadier and light infantry battalions. While some light infantry companies were present, there were no grenadiers, so they should not be here. Okay, what on earth is this? As mentioned, the British had a few 6-pounder guns, which were very light. These are massive! They look like siege guns more than anything. The Royal Artillery also wore blue uniforms faced red, not red faced blue. Granted, there were some infantry who had been detached to help with the artillery, but the men firing these pieces would be in blue faced red. Apparently, having British soldiers anything but red would confuse people. There also appears to be a cavalryman at the back carrying a rather large regimental standard. This is wrong, since the cavalry carried guidons, which were very small, and a lot of them the cavalry didn't even bring their standards with them. Oh yes, and I know this is in a lot of films, but the bulk of the ammunition these guns were firing would be either round shot or canister shot, neither of which explode like modern day howitzer shells do. But then, more explosions make a better film. Just ask Michael Bay. I will give them this, the Americans are at least using the correct drill commands. In the British Army, it was make ready, present, whilst following the instructions of von Steuben, the Americans used the command make ready, take aim. My problem, though, is that the film portrays these particular troops as being raw recruits, completely unsuited to going against the British. Mel Gibson himself says this.
That Gates is a damn fool. He spent too many years in the British Army. Going muzzle to muzzle with redcoats in open field, it's madness.
Problem is, though, is that, historically, the regulars were the ones who held their ground and even drove back the British left at one point. The war had been raging for 5 years by this point, so there were plenty of experienced men and officers in the American army. It was the militia who were the nervous ones who ran away. Do we see this in the film? No. All the troops in this battle are the regulars, not a militiaman in sight. The cynic in me says they did this to make Mel Gibson and his militia look even more heroic later on in the film, but in doing so they ended up insulting the regular troops of the Continental Line, who were certainly capable of holding their own in the field against the British.
Oh! Make ready! Present!
Oh, crikey, that was an effective volley. I mean, in the real battle, when Webster's men fired their first volley, they probably didn't even hit too many people. Again, only 3 men out of the 700 Virginians were wounded. Here, about half the American line goes down. Okay, so in this battle, the entire American army runs away after one volley, whilst the cavalry attack from the left side, and both the infantry and cavalry completely break formations and go after them. There are these things soldiers used called formations, and I wish more war films would use them. Soldiers don't run hell for leather at the enemy. Bayonet charges are a bit more organised than that. Granted, sometimes men do lose formation, but not like this. Not to mention that, as I stated earlier, the Continentals held very bravely and did not break and run like this. In this film, they replaced Tarleton with Jason Isaacs' character, since, that guy does evil roles very well, and renamed the British Legion, made up of green-coated loyalist foot and horse, to the Green Dragoons, an all-cavalry unit with redcoats. Again, not every single British soldier wears red. We now get this final line from Cornwallis.
These rustics are so inept. Nearly takes the honour out of victory. Nearly.
Firstly, the officer next to him is meant to be Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, an Irish officer who served at Guildford Courthouse and was not present at Camden. Secondly, his comment is just so sneering. The real-life Cornwallis, as mentioned, praised de Kalb and sent his own surgeons to tend to his wounds. I doubt we'd have had a good opinion of the militia, but the Continentals and their officers had his respect. Also, he wasn't standing way at the back during this battle. He was at the front with the Volunteers of Ireland rallying them. Mel Gibson has often been accused of having a hatred of the English, and I can honestly see why people think this. The British officers are all portrayed negatively. English officers, despite there being a lot of Scots and Irish troops on the British side of this battle. Everyone speaks with an English accent. What I find worse, though, is that, in order to make the militia the heroes of the film later on, they actually end up insulting the regular soldiers, making them out to be raw, nervous recruits, despite their brave stand, and don't even acknowledge people like de Kalb, who was shot 3 times and stabbed 8 times, for God's sake. I haven't even got onto the slaves being happy to be slaves, the English burning down a church full of women and children, etc. But it's just such a horrible film in general, let alone the small details which they just cast aside in order to make their narrative. Sadly, some people have bought it hook, line and sinker.
The 5th installment in the series takes us from the 1700s to the 1800s. The time period that included the American Revolution, personified by one of my favorite movies, The Patriot.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Laughing Cavalier, wishing you a good day.
Attack.